The branches clawed at their faces, skeletal fingers coated in ice. Lynn's lungs burned, each gasp a mouthful of frozen air that felt like swallowing needles. Beside her, Anne stumbled, her identical face pale and strained in the dying light. Their white dresses, a cruel joke of purity their stepfather had insisted upon, were ripped and smeared with mud and pine resin. They were ghosts in a dying forest, and the hunter was close behind. His voice coiled through the trees, a sound they knew better than their own heartbeats. "Girls! Lynn! Anne! It's just a game! Come on back now!" It was his sweet voice, the one he used before the punishments, the one that promised warmth and delivered a cold fury. Lynn grabbed her sister's arm, pulling her behind a massive fallen log, its bulk covered in a thick shroud of snow. They pressed themselves into the frozen earth, trying to make their breathing silent, trying to will their shivering bodies still. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder, a rhythmic, terrifying drumbeat. He was so close they could smell the cheap tobacco on his coat. "I know you're out here," Mr. Sterling called, the sweetness curdling into impatience. "Don't make me get angry. You know what happens when I get angry." Lynn squeezed her eyes shut, praying to gods she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Anne's hand found hers in the darkness, a desperate, trembling grip. The footsteps paused, mere feet from their hiding spot. A long, agonizing silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of snow falling from the pines. Then, with a frustrated curse, the footsteps moved on, growing fainter as he continued his sweep of the lower woods. They waited, not daring to move, until the sound was completely swallowed by the immense silence of the mountain. They hadn't escaped. They had only bought a few more minutes. With a shared look of grim understanding, they rose, their limbs stiff and aching, and pushed themselves higher, away from the path, away from anything that looked like civilization. Up, into the heart of the winter, where the cold was a cleaner kind of killer. They didn't know how long they climbed. The moon rose, a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering no warmth, only a stark, unforgiving light that made the snowfields glitter like broken glass. Anne was lagging, her steps becoming a shuffle. Lynn could feel the last of her own strength seeping away, draining into the snow with every painful step. The world was narrowing to a tunnel of white and black, the howl of the rising wind the only sound. Then Anne went down. Not a stumble, but a quiet collapse, a marionette with its strings cut. She lay in the snow, a crumpled heap of white cotton, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Lynn fell to her knees beside her, shaking her shoulder. "Anne, get up! Please, we have to keep going!" But her sister's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Lynn's exhaustion. This was it. This was where they would be found, frozen and still, two matching dolls broken on the mountainside. She tried to pull Anne to her feet, but her own limbs were numb and useless. She slumped over her sister, a futile attempt to shield her from the wind, and prepared for the end. That's when she saw it. A light. A small, bobbing point of gold in the swirling darkness. At first she thought she was imagining it, a last desperate trick of a dying mind. But it grew steadily closer, resolving into a lantern held aloft. A figure emerged from the blizzard, a silhouette so large it seemed carved from the mountain itself. A giant of a man, broad-shouldered and immense, with a wild tangle of long, dark hair and a beard thick with ice. Fear, primal and immediate, seized her. They had traded one monster for another. She instinctively tried to cover Anne's body with her own. The man stopped a good 10 feet away, holding the lantern high. The light illuminated a weathered face and eyes that were surprisingly calm. He didn't move closer. He simply stood there, a bulwark against the storm. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening. It was just a fact. Lynn couldn't find her voice. He waited. The silence was his, a patient, heavy thing. "The storm's getting worse. You'll not last the night out here." He took a half step back, a gesture of retreat that was so unexpected it stunned her. "My cabin is close. It's warm. You can take shelter there." He wasn't commanding them. He was offering. Lynn looked down at Anne, whose shivering was growing weaker. They had no choice. There was the monster they knew and the monster they didn't. But this one was offering warmth. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to get her sister sitting up. The man watched but did not approach. "Can you walk?" he asked. Lynn shook her head. "I can't carry her." The man looked from her to Anne, then back again. "May I?" The question was so soft, so courteous, it felt alien in the howling wind. Lynn stared at him, at the sheer power in his frame held in check by a simple question. She gave a jerky, hesitant nod. Only then did he move forward. He scooped Anne up as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his vast chest with a strange gentleness. He looked at Lynn. "Follow the light." And with that, he turned and began to walk back into the storm, leaving her to follow the golden glow of the lantern. The cabin was small, a single room built of dark, heavy logs chinked with mud and moss. It was an extension of the mountain itself, solid and unyielding. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else. Something clean and wild, like pine needles after rain. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire roaring within it, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. The heat was a physical blow, so intense after the biting cold that Lynn felt dizzy. The man, Owen, as she would later learn his name was, gently laid on a thick pallet of furs near the fire. He moved with a quiet economy, his massive frame navigating the small space without a single wasted motion. He didn't speak to them, didn't look at them directly. He moved to a small table, ladled something thick and steaming from a pot hanging over the fire into 2 wooden bowls, and placed them on the floor, far from where he stood. He then laid 2 folded, heavy wool blankets beside the bowls. He retreated to the far side of the room, near a simple cot, and sat on a stool, turning his attention to a piece of leather in his hands. He had drawn a line down the middle of the room with his actions, a clear and unspoken boundary. Lynn watched him, every nerve ending still screaming with suspicion. Men did not offer help without a price. Men did not give without intending to take. But he just sat there, his presence filling the room, yet demanding nothing from it. Hesitantly, Lynn crawled over to her sister. Anne's eyes were open now, tracking the giant figure with the same fearful caution. Lynn touched her forehead. It was cold, but she was no longer shivering violently. The warmth of the cabin was slowly seeping into her bones. The smell of the stew, venison and root vegetables, rich and savory, was making Lynn's stomach ache with a hunger so fierce it was painful. She looked from the bowls to the man. He didn't look up. It was as if he had set the offering down, and now it was entirely their decision what to do with it. Slowly, carefully, Lynn pulled one of the bowls closer. She took a spoonful, the warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling so comforting it almost made her weep. She helped Anne sit up, and together they ate in silence, their eyes never leaving the man on the other side of the room. When they were finished, he still hadn't moved. He finally looked over, his gaze calm. "This side of the hearth is yours," he said, his voice that same low rumble. "I will not cross to it. You are safe here." Safe. The word was a foreign country. She didn't believe him. Not yet. But as she and Anne huddled together under the thick wool blankets, the firelight painting the walls gold and the storm raging impotently outside, a tiny, fragile seed of something other than terror began to take root in the frozen ground of her heart. For the first time in days, they slept. The days that followed fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm, a silent dance of coexistence. Owen would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire back to life. He would leave the cabin and be gone for hours, returning with firewood stacked high on his arm, or a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He never announced his departures or his arrivals. The only sign was the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the absence or presence of his immense, contained energy. He spoke very little, and when he did, it was practical. "There's more stew. The water bucket needs filling. The snow is deep today." His silence wasn't hostile. It felt deliberate, a form of respect, giving them space not just physically but orally too. He was letting the quiet heal them. Lynn and Anne remained on their side of the hearth, a small island in the vast ocean of his cabin. At first they barely moved, speaking to each other only in hushed whispers of Mandarin, their words a secret garden in a strange land. They watched him constantly, cataloging his every move, waiting for the mask to slip, for the kindness to reveal itself as a trap. But it never did. He mended their worn-out shoes, stitching new soles of thick leather onto the flimsy things without a word, leaving them by the hearth to find. He washed his own bowl and utensils in a bucket of snow melt, but left theirs for them to tend to, a small but significant acknowledgment of their autonomy. One afternoon he sat by the fire, pulling a long hunting knife from its sheath. He produced a whetstone and a small flask of oil, then began a sound that would come to define their time in that cabin, a slow, rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. Shink, shink, shink. It was a measured, patient sound, not violent, but a sound of maintenance, of readiness. At first, the sharp whisper of the blade set Lynn's teeth on edge, a reminder of the violence men were capable of. But as the days turned into a week, the sound became something else. It was the sound of competence, the sound of a man who knew how to survive, who kept his tools in order. It became the sound of their strange, fragile safety. Shink, shink, shink. It was the steady heartbeat of their refuge. They started to relax in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. Anne's shoulders lowered from their permanent perch by her ears. Lynn found she could look away from him for minutes at a time, her gaze drifting to the flames or the patterns of frost on the single small window pane. He had promised them safety, and while they didn't yet understand it, he was keeping his word in the only way that mattered, through relentless, respectful consistency. One morning, nearly 2 weeks into their stay, Lynn woke to the sound of a harsh, ragged cough. Anne was curled into a tight ball under the blankets, her body trembling with a violent fever. A flush of deep red colored her cheeks, and her skin was hot to the touch. Panic, a familiar, acidic taste, flooded Lynn's mouth. Sickness was a danger they couldn't outrun. In the world they'd come from, illness was a weakness their stepfather punished, a failing to be scorned. Here, in the vast, indifferent wilderness, it could be a death sentence. For a few frantic moments, Lynn did the only thing she knew how. She bathed her sister's forehead with a damp rag, whispering useless words of comfort. But the fever only seemed to climb, and Anne's breathing grew more shallow. She looked across the cabin at Owen. He was watching them, his usual work set aside. His expression was unreadable, but his stillness was absolute, a mountain waiting. The invisible line he had drawn on their first night felt like a chasm. To cross it was to break the only rule they had, to cede the small territory they had been given. But Anne coughed again, a weak, rattling sound that tore at Lynn's heart. Fear for her sister finally outweighed her fear of the man. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Lynn stood up and walked across the room. She stopped a few feet from him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. It was the first time she had willingly entered his space. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited, letting her be the one to break the silence. "She's sick," Lynn said, her voice small and tight. "Her chest is hot." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He rose from his stool, his height and breadth momentarily overwhelming. But then he did something that disarmed her completely. He took a step back, creating more space between them. "Willow bark," he said, his voice low and calm. "It helps with the fever." He gestured toward a bundle of dried branches hanging from the rafters. "I will make a tea. May I come closer to the hearth to tend to her? Again the question, the request for permission. It was a lifeline. Lynn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He moved to the fire, his presence suddenly filling their small space, but it was a careful, deliberate presence. He didn't hover over Anne. He prepared the tea, showing Lynn how to steep the bark in hot water, his large hands surprisingly deft. He explained in his quiet way that the fire needed to be kept steady, not too hot. He was not taking over, he was teaching her. He handed the warm cup to Lynn for her to give to her sister. He then retreated back to his side of the room, leaving them be. Over the next 2 days, as Lynn tended to Anne, following his quiet instructions, something fundamental shifted. The boundary had been crossed, not by force, but by invitation and necessity. And he had honored it, retreating the moment he was no longer needed. As Anne's fever finally broke, leaving her weak but lucid, Lynn looked over at the mountain of a man, sitting in his usual spot, sharpening his knife. Shink, shink, shink. The sound was no longer just about safety. It was the sound of trust, being honed and sharpened, one slow, steady stroke at a time. As Anne recovered her strength, the stark reality of their situation remained. They had nothing but the torn white dresses on their backs and the blankets Owen had given them. The flimsy cotton was useless against the deep, persistent cold of the mountain winter. One afternoon, Owen returned from his trap lines, shaking snow from his heavy outer garments. He was carrying 2 bundles of dark, thick fur. He walked to the invisible line that still divided the cabin and set them down on Lynn and Anne's side. They were coats, crudely made but incredibly thick, stitched together from wolf pelts. They smelled of the wild, of pine and cold air. "These are warmer," he said, his standard, understated declaration. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply turned and went about his business, stoking the fire. The coats were a profound gift. They were survival. They were a recognition that their stay might be longer than a few days. Later that evening, Lynn sat by the fire, trying to mend a long tear in the skirt of her dress with a clumsy makeshift needle she'd fashioned from a fishbone. Her fingers were clumsy, the thread thick and uneven. Owen watched her for a moment from across the room. He got up, went to a small wooden chest in the corner, and came back with a small waxed paper packet. He walked to the line, knelt, and set it on the floor in front of her. Inside were 2 sharp steel needles and a spool of fine, strong thread. He didn't just hand it to her, he placed it in her space for her to take. It was another lesson in his silent language of respect. This time, a question burned in Lynn, a need to understand the quiet charity that felt so alien. She looked up from the packet, meeting his gaze directly. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping us?" He stopped what he was doing and looked into the heart of the fire, his expression thoughtful. The flames lit the weathered lines of his face. He was silent for a long time. Not an uncomfortable silence, but a considered one. "A long time ago," he began, his voice a low rumble, "my wife and daughter were caught in a blizzard trying to get to town. They were looking for help." He paused, the grief a palpable presence in the small cabin. No one stopped. No one offered them a warm fire. He looked back at Lynn, his eyes holding a sorrow so deep it seemed as old as the mountains themselves. "Everyone deserves a warm fire," he said simply. "No one should have to run like that. No one should be alone in the cold." He turned back to his own tasks, the conversation over. But his words remained, hanging in the warm air. That mattered. It wasn't pity he was offering. It was empathy. It was a quiet, profound atonement for a world that had failed his family. For the first time, Lynn felt the hard knot of fear in her chest truly begin to dissolve, replaced by a fragile, tentative warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The rhythm of their lives in the cabin became a source of comfort, a quiet melody of survival and slow healing wounds. The sound of Owen sharpening his tools, the smell of wood smoke, the taste of hot stew, these were the anchors of their new reality. But the mountain had a memory, and the world below did not forget so easily. The change was subtle at first. Owen began spending more time outside, even when the weather was foul. He wasn't checking traps or chopping wood. He was just standing at the edge of the clearing, looking down the slope, his posture rigid and watchful. The easy pace of his work disappeared, replaced by a quiet urgency. He spent an entire afternoon reinforcing the heavy wooden door, adding a new thick crossbar of ironwood. He didn't explain why, and Lynn didn't ask. She knew. The peace was a borrowed thing, and the debt was coming due. The rhythmic sound of the whetstone changed too. He no longer did it in the calm of the afternoon. Now he sharpened his axe and his knife late at night, after the cabin was dark save for the glowing embers in the hearth. The sound sliced through the silence, no longer soothing. Shink, shink, shink. It was faster now, sharper, with an edge of grim purpose. It was the sound of a man preparing for a fight. It was the sound of their sanctuary turning into a fortress. Fear, which had receded to a dull ache, returned with a vengeance, cold and sharp in Lynn's belly. She saw it in Anne's eyes, too, the same haunted, hunted look they'd worn when they first arrived. They spoke about it in hushed Mandarin when Owen was outside. "He knows," Anne whispered, twisting a loose thread on her blanket. "He's coming." Lynn didn't need to ask who. There was only one he. Every snap of a twig outside, every howl of the wind that sounded almost human, made them jump. The cabin, once a haven, now felt like a trap. It was the only place they were safe, and the only place he would know to look. One afternoon Owen returned, his face grim. He didn't speak, but he set a fresh deer hide down and began methodically cutting a long, thin strip from it. He used it to lash the handle of his axe, his movements tight and controlled. Lynn watched his knuckles, white as he pulled the leather taut. He finally looked at them, his gaze direct and heavy. "There are tracks down by the creek," he said, his voice flat. "A shod horse. Been there a day or two." He didn't need to say more. No one else came this high up the mountain in the dead of winter. The outside world was closing in, and the fragile peace of their mountain refuge was about to be shattered. The hunter had found their trail. The knock on the door, when it finally came, was not a sound of inquiry. It was a heavy, percussive blow, the sound of ownership, of a man who believed he had the right to enter any door he pleased. Thump, thump, thump. It echoed the frantic, terrified beating of Lynn's own heart. Anne let out a small, choked gasp and scrambled back from the door, pressing herself against the far wall. Lynn froze where she stood, her blood turning to ice. Owen rose slowly from his stool, not with alarm, but with a weary, deliberate gravity. He was a bear rising from hibernation, ancient and powerful. He didn't pick up his axe. He simply moved to stand in front of the door, his body a solid wall of muscle and resolve. "I know they're in there, you filthy vagrant," the voice boomed from outside, thick with rage and entitlement. It was Mr. Sterling. The sound of his voice in this place, their sanctuary, felt like a desecration. "Those are my girls, property of my house. You send them out now, or I'll burn this shack to the ground with you in it." Owen didn't answer the man outside. He didn't even look at the door. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his gaze finding Lynn and Anne where they huddled by the hearth. He looked at them, and in his eyes was a question. He was not going to speak for them. He was not going to decide for them. After all the silence, all the gentle care, this was his greatest gift, the choice. He had built the walls, he had barred the door, but the voice he was leaving to them. A tremor ran through Lynn's body. All her life she had been silent. She had swallowed her words, choked on her fear, and endured. Her silence had been her shield, a way to become small and invisible. But she saw now that silence was not a shield. It was a cage. She looked at her sister Anne, whose face was a mask of pure terror, her eyes pleading. And in that moment, something shifted inside Lynn. It was the memory of the cold, the feel of Owen's gentle hands as he taught her to make tea, the solid weight of the warm coat on her shoulders. It was the quiet dignity he had afforded them every single day. He had treated them not as property, but as people. Stepping away from the wall, Lynn put herself in front of her sister. She took a breath, the air tasting of smoke and fear. She walked toward the door, stopping just behind Owen's immense back. Her voice, when it came out, was a thin, trembling thing, but it was hers. She spoke to the solid wood of the door, but her words were aimed at the man outside. "We are not your girls," she said. The words were quiet, but in the tense silence of the cabin, they landed with the force of a physical blow. Outside, Mr. Sterling roared with disbelief, then fury. "What did you say? You ungrateful little wretch! After everything I've given you, a roof over your heads, food in your bellies, you belong to me!" He slammed his fist against the door again, making the timbers groan. "You have no say in this. I'm your father." "You are not our father," Lynn said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. She could feel Owen's stillness in front of her, an unmovable anchor. He was letting her fight her own battle, but he was there, her shield. The man outside changed his tactics, his voice shifting to that old false sweetness that turned Lynn's stomach. "Now, girls, don't be foolish. It's cold out here. This man, this animal, he can't care for you. Come home. All will be forgiven." Forgiven. The word was a mockery. Forgiven for what? For running from his cruelty? For wanting to breathe without fear? This time it was Anne who spoke. She moved to stand beside Lynn, her hand finding her sister's. Her voice was louder than Lynn's had been, laced with a righteous anger that had been buried for years. "We are never coming back," she said, her words sharp and clear. "You will never touch us again. You will never lock us in our room again. Never." The word hung in the air, a final, unbreakable vow. Never. Mr. Sterling let out a string of curses, his threats becoming more desperate, more violent. He promised retribution, promised he'd come back with the law, with men who would drag them out. But his power was in their fear, and their fear was dying, being burned away by the fire of their own voices. Finally, Owen spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was so low and resonant that it seemed to vibrate through the very logs of the cabin. It was the sound of the mountain itself finding a voice. "You heard them," he rumbled, his words directed through the door. "They have made their choice." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. This is their home now, if they want it. Go. There was a long, tense silence from outside. Then the sound of a man defeated. A final, impotent curse, muffled by the snow. The crunch of boots, angry and heavy, retreating from the cabin, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was finally, blessedly, gone. It was over. The only sound left was the whisper of the fire and the ragged, relieved sound of their own breathing. The silence that descended upon the cabin was different from the peaceful quiet that had preceded the confrontation. This was a heavy, ringing silence, the kind that follows a great storm. The echoes of Mr. Sterling's rage and their own defiant voices still seemed to hang in the air. Then the tension broke. A choked sob escaped Anne's lips, and then another, until she was weeping freely, her body shaking with the release of years of pent-up fear, grief, and anger. Lynn wrapped her arms around her sister, holding her tight, her own tears tracking silently down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of catharsis. They had spoken. They had been heard. They had won. Through it all, Owen remained by the door for a long moment, as if ensuring the threat was truly gone. Then he turned. He didn't rush to them, didn't offer platitudes or crowd their grief. He simply walked to the hearth, his movements as deliberate as ever, and placed another large log on the fire. The flames leaped up, casting a warm, steady light over the two weeping sisters. It was an act of quiet care, of tending to the center of their world while they mended the edges of it. He was giving them their space, even now. He understood that their tears were as necessary as the fire, a cleansing burn of their own. Later, when the storm of emotion had passed and a fragile calm had settled over the room, Lynn looked up. Anne had cried herself to sleep, her head resting in Lynn's lap, her face relaxed in a way Lynn hadn't seen since they were small children. Owen was sitting on his stool again, watching the fire. Lynn's voice was hoarse from crying when she spoke. You said this is our home, if we want it." Owen turned his head, his calm, steady gaze meeting hers. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, revealing a deep-seated gentleness. He didn't offer a grand speech or make a sweeping promise. He just gave a slow, simple nod. "It's your choice," he said. The words were the foundation of everything. Not a command, not a trap, not an obligation, a choice. Lynn looked around the small, rough-hewn cabin. She saw the sturdy walls that had kept the storm out, the warm hearth that had thawed the ice in their bones, the invisible line on the floor that had taught them the meaning of respect. She looked at her sister, sleeping a true, peaceful sleep for the first time in memory. And she looked at this quiet, solitary giant who had offered them refuge without demanding anything in return, who had shown them that strength could be gentle, and that a home wasn't a place you were kept, but a place you chose to stay. A small, real smile touched her lips for the first time. "We want it," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We choose to stay." In his eyes, she saw not surprise, but a quiet, profound acceptance. The fire crackled, the logs settled, and for the first time, the future did not feel like a threat, but a promise, quiet and steady as the mountain itself.